right, I think we are about ready to get started as people are coming in. Good evening, everyone. I think most of us are here now. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm Dr. Mara Schiff, Associate Professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, housed within the School of Social Work and Criminal Justice at Florida Atlantic University. The community that's gathered here tonight is comprised of students, faculty, staff, administrators, special guests, and friends of FAU, campus partners, and engaged community members. We are so grateful that you have chosen to spend this next hour with us. Our college launched this conversation series as a place to learn, discuss, and explore issues affecting our local communities, with a particular focus on where the professions of social work and criminal justice intersect. The College of Social Work and Criminal Justice is uniquely positioned to host these impactful conversations because of our mission. We are striving to build a more just, resilient, and equitable society. We are change makers and innovators serving the public good by working across our professions and deeply within our communities. And this is why we are here tonight. A few housekeeping issues before we get started. First, we intend for this to be a conversation, and we want to hear from you. Please post your comments in the chat box, and we will respond to as many as possible during the Q&A. Just after you hear from our panelists and right before the Q&A begins, we will share a link to a quick survey. It's important that you complete it for 3 reasons. 1, your feedback helps us deliver future events like this one in ways that are meaningful for you. 2, if you are a student and receiving extra credit for your attendance, your survey response will be shared with your professor to verify that you were here. And 3, if you are a licensed mental health professional or nurse and earning a CEU credit for your attendance, thank you for being here and for all you do for our communities. We will need your survey response to generate your CEU certificate, which you can expect to receive your certificate via email within the next 10 business days. All of that said, I am excited now to introduce you to our panelists. I'm going to introduce them all at once right now, and then we're going to launch into a conversation where, with any luck, I'm going to get to bow out because I think they have far more interesting and engaging things on this topic to say than I possibly could. So I want to introduce you first to Crystal Morris. Crystal is founder and CEO of One Caring Adult, Inc. As a culture and climate architect, Crystal educates school districts, police departments, and private organizations on strategies to transform trauma to resilience by fostering meaningful relationships and culturally responsive spaces. Next up, we will have Dr. Janet Finn, who is a social anthropologist and former social work professor at the University of Montana. Dr. Finn holds MSW and PhD degrees and has authored and edited numerous publications about community, women, childhood, youth, social justice, and transnational issues. Our third panelist is Dre Johnson. Mr. Johnson holds an MSW degree from the FAU Sandler School of Social Work and is a licensed clinical social worker. Dre is one of the leading intellectual voices for social and community justice in upstate New York and currently serves as the emergency response social work team leader for New York's first mental health emergency response unit. Our fourth panelist is Dr. David Anderson Hooker, founder and principal narrator for Counter Stories Consulting, LLC. Counter Stories engages as a conversation and visioning partner with global civil society organizations and religious groups to craft narratives of their preferred futures and align organizational structures and internal practices in furtherance of their constructed narratives. Dr. Hooker has nearly 40 years of training and expertise in conflict transformation and peace building, particularly when socially constructed variables significantly impact the disputed context. So we are really delighted to welcome each and every one of you here, our panelists and our participants, and we thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us this evening as we try to navigate and unpack important questions surrounding justice. So I'm going to jump right in now to the conversation, and I'm going to start off in 2 ways. I'm going to start off first by giving the introduction by which we invited you all to this conversation, which centers on the notions of how do you define justice and how notions of just and unjust differ across time, experience, culture, and circumstance. We know contradictions exist about understanding justice within institutions of authority, such as prisons, courts, hospitals, and schools. And we want to look at what are the roadblocks to transformational change and how can we resolve or dissolve them. So I'm going to open with a really broad question and ask each of our panelists, what does justice mean to you? How, if at all, would you define it? Or maybe more accurately, how do you know it when you see it? I will start. I'm going to start by inviting Crystal to join in, or anybody else who wants to join in. I hope to direct this conversation as little as possible, and for you guys to engage as much as possible with one another. So, sorry, Ms. Morris, could you start us off?
You just threw me out there. So hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So for me, if I had to define it, I would say that justice is a byproduct of relationships. You don't have justice if you don't have relationships, because you need relationships in order to make informed decisions. So if you go by the dictionary definition of justice, it will say you're doing what is fair and right. But that is completely relative to the lens at which you look at the situation you're facing. So if you are able to have informed decision making by forming relationships with the people that you are serving, that's the only way to have justice. You have to know the lived experiences, know what happened or is currently happening to generate the actions and the behaviors that you're seeing in order for you to make decisions that chances are in line with your core beliefs and your value system, but to make something that is going to ultimately benefit the individual that you're serving so that everyone gets desired outcomes that are satisfactory and not just tolerable. So I throw that out there for justice.
Thank you. Dr. Finn, would you like to chime in?
Thank you for having me here as well. And I think of justice a lot in terms of the social justice frame around social work, but I want to speak more broadly first. And I really appreciate Crystal's comments about the relational capacities or relational perspective on justice. And I think we often think in terms of economic justice, justice under the law, and I think those are very key components, as well as justice being grounded in human dignity and human rights, the right to cultural recognition, the right to political representation, the right to economic redistribution to a just society, the right to have one's capacities and capabilities flourish because the arrangements of society allow for that. The right to memory, the right to one's history, the history of a community and a people. I think all those are key components, and that right to have a meaningful voice in key decisions that affect our lives and not have that voice squelched or distorted by those with more power. So it also has a real strong power sharing element when I think of justice.
Thank you. I'm going to ask your permission for a minute. Are you okay if we use first names? I notice I'm struggling with first names and titles, given that I know some of you better than others. Would you guys be okay if I use first names? And please, I invite you to do the same with me. Dre, would you like to jump in?
Sure. So happy Black History Month to everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm a visual learner, so when you ask what is justice to me, I think of a picture that I saw, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this picture, so I'll try to describe it to you, and it may ring a bell. There's 3 people in the picture. There's a tall gentleman in the picture. It's like a cartoon picture. It's like a caricature almost. So it's like a tall man in the picture. There's like a medium-sized person in the picture, and then there's a really small person in the picture, and they're all trying to look over a wooden fence. And so like the first picture, it says like equality, and they're all standing on a box, and all 3 of the boxes are the same size, except the guy who's the tallest of the 3 can already see over the fence, and he's watching the soccer game that they're all trying to see. And it looks like maybe it's a woman next to him, she's a little shorter, she can just barely see over the fence because she's on a box as well. And then the shorter person is not able to see over the fence. They're still blinded by the fence because they're too short to see it, in the box that of equality is not tall enough to get them over the fence. But then in the second picture frame, it's equity, and equity is basically each person's box is a different size. So the guy who's tall enough to see over the fence already, he doesn't have a box at all. He's still able to see the game. Now the woman who's in the middle, who's about medium height, she has one box, so she's now able to see the game. But then the shortest person in the picture is standing on two boxes so that they are now able to see the game that they're all trying to watch. And justice is the total removal of that wooden fence that obstructs the vision of the three folks from seeing the game in and of itself. So when you see the third picture, it's a picture of all three folks standing behind a gate, which is clear so that everybody could see the game at the same time. And I thought that picture really spoke volumes to me about how to really separate and differentiate equity, equality, and justice. So I'll pretty much just leave it at that. That is what justice is to me. I think the picture really tells the tale. So with that, I'll bounce it over to David.
Great, thanks. So when I see that picture, it always tickles me because I wonder if justice is accomplished without them actually being able to get in the game if they want to, right? Like, is there still a level of marginalization that requires them to watch the game and let other people flourish? So, but I appreciate the visual that you've constructed for us. Mara and I spent Dr. Schiff and I spent
we're going first
almost 2 years wrestling with this idea of justice and the language, and the fact that what we arrived at was this notion that justice is an ineffective signifier. That's lovely linguistic language, which is to say that the word itself doesn't craft the same idea in everybody's mind when it's being used. And so it's an ineffective signifier. And so I don't talk as much about justice, but the way that I think about it, what I'm looking for is very much a combination of Crystal and Janet's kind of framing. And I mean, it's got a lot of Dre's thinking in it too. What I try to make it concise. Justice is likely to emerge when every being, sentient being, that's the whole ecology, human and non-human, every life form, has fundamentally equitable access to the relationships, resources, structures, and testimonial authority that they need to survive, to thrive, and to manifest their full capabilities, right? And to be able to contribute to a greater good. And so I've been working with that. And so I'm always looking and pushing in any of those dimensions, like justice is more likely to emerge as each of those aspects is actually coming true or is being manifested. So that's what I got.
Thank you. So one of the things that's also clear in this conversation, and that we know, because it's what brought many of us here, is that we know that notions of just and unjust really differ across time, experience, culture, circumstance. So how has your understanding of this affected your thinking and your work? And how does this bear on the work you now do and what you think others should know and practice around this term that we use, justice? And I'm going to open that up to anybody who would like to jump in.
Always let me jump under the bus first. Why is this? We have to do better, people.
I tried to let you off the hook.
I'll take a stab at it first. I think, and I know you call me naive for this, right? But I believe at the core of every person, except the rare few, that at the core we're all good people. I just don't think we're always aware of the lens in which we see the world. We see the world through our lived experiences, through the resources we had at our disposal, through our privilege. that's how we see the world, and we oftentimes project that same ability onto everyone else, thinking I did, so you should be able to, whether you came from the have or the have not. That's how we see the world. And because of that, it limits our ability for that key word that David mentioned, for equity. Equity is not a bad zero-sum game. Equity is truly driven by outcome. What does each individual need in order for them to have the outcome that is reasonable and accessible for every other person, right? You don't have to go out of your way for this big thing. So it's not taking from, it's giving to. And a lot of times I think that a lot of well-intended people make shifts, make policies, do all of this work with the intention to allow their younger self or the people in their circles to be able to live and breathe and thrive, not understanding that there's so many other people that don't come from their space, from their walk of life. So what might be just to you might not be just to them. I think it's a lack oftentimes of awareness of who is being impacted. I think that's one of the keys that's missing, and that's why what seems to be justice turns out to be injustice for so many, and that's why we have so many different ways in which we do. So hopefully that opens it up so everyone else can jump in and say something.
Yet there is no natural order to this. The order in which I started does not need to maintain throughout this conversation. So please jump in and what strikes you when you hear either what I asked or how Crystal responded?
I'll jump in, and partly I want to sort of respond to and build on what Crystal said once again. And you know, I think of my own early career in social work in both juvenile justice and child welfare as a young white woman who at that time, I didn't have a sense of what my own whiteness meant coming into these spaces and the privilege that I carried with me. And so I feel like I came with a certain naivete and then was living the contradictions of these systems, you know, as the young woman with the keys and the power to lock up young women my age. And there was something so fundamentally wrong that I felt in my gut, but I didn't have the concepts to manage well. And I had to really grapple with those contradictions to come up with the concepts to manage that. And that's been a lifelong process since that time to try to see how systems that I thought I was going into helping systems were just so rife with so much injustice embedded in them, and to try to peel that back and understand that in different ways and grapple with that and try to balance a sense of urgency to do something with a sense of humility about my good intentions might have very damning effects. And so I've tried to then put that together in my own thinking and practice as a social worker and as a social worker and social work educator, to think about meaning making, to think about power relations, the contexts that we work in and how they are so embedded with power and in inequality, how we need to understand the history of our ideas and our practices and where they're rooted and how deeply they may be rooted in, you know, strongly white racist ways of thinking and doing that have to be dismantled to move forward. And at the same time, holding on to that sense of possibility that we can, through those relational components, through a resistance and hope and action, move in directions for change.
I feel like I want to amplify something that you said, Janet, if I can. You talked about the struggle between moving forward with urgency versus humility. And I think that's oftentimes where so many people get it wrong. You hear something that you've never heard before, it causes this discomfort, this dis-ease, and you want to do something to fix it. So there's this rush to act, which oftentimes results in something that is performative, something that is transactional, something that ends up causing more harm than good, but we slap justice on it. We slap DEI on it. We say that we are change makers and change agents, not realizing that the better route to take is one of humility. And humility doesn't mean that you drink from the top of that what is it, that tranquil drug of gradualism, but instead it means that you figure out where you are in this. You center yourself and you what caused me to be so okay with status quo all this time, never wanting to question or ask or to seek out information. And then after you've done that intrapersonal work, then you get to build interpersonal relationships with other people to hear their lived experiences, to start to co-create this new possibility, so that your intentions aren't centered on you and your discomfort, your disease, but it's truly centered on the communities you wish to serve, your teammates, your students, whoever it is that you serve. But you're truly doing something that is beneficial to others because it is driven and it's informed by them. Which is why I started off with saying that, to me, justice is a byproduct of relationships. You can't get to truly do what is beneficial for a person outside of giving them space and voice and understanding they are the subject matter experts. You might be amazing at crafting projects and procedures, but if you don't have the true experts sitting at the table, not just in the room, and then giving them a bullhorn to amplify their voices, you're nowhere close to the ballpark of justice. You're just doing something to help people benefit.
So one of the things that I want to not lose is that part of our conversation is about the intersection or the places where social work and criminal justice and to some extent mental health are implicated in this conversation. And what I would say, I'm glad we're on webinar and people are not able to unmute themselves and boo me for this, but what I would say is that historically, at least in the United States and in many other places, mental health, social work, and criminal justice all align in their agreement to constrain the freedom-seeking behaviors of previously marginalized people who are choosing to try and find their way into society or have their voice be incorporated in the new norms that are being established. Most of the norms that were established without a variety of people. Women weren't included. Most people of color were not included. Non-property owning people were not included, which meant a lot of poor whites were excluded as well. And as folks try to raise their voice to be involved, to create that kind of relationality that allows them to fully flourish, social work, mental health, and criminal and legal justice systems are organized in ways to constrain freedom-seeking behavior, right? And so it's difficult when we are taught, particularly those of us who were groomed in those different canons, it's hard to have learned them and mastered them, which is what you have to do first in order to get licensure, to get access to those systems. You have to master them. It's hard once you've mastered them to step outside of the logic that creates them. And so I think that's one of the things, is that we're operating with a collective of at least three professional arenas, none of which were designed for justice. They were designed primarily for order, social order.
I agree. I feel like, to David's point, we aren't even beginning. I guess we're beginning, but at a snail's pace in terms of breaking those norms that David spoke about. Like, we still have huge disparities. And I feel like a silver lining of COVID is that it has very clearly showed huge disparities, not just in our country, but around the world. I think when I look at the news and I see this fear of CRT or critical race theory, like, people are afraid of it, like it's COVID or something. Like, oh, we don't want CRT in our schools. Most people don't even know what it is, but it's the truth. It's factual, historical knowledge. They don't want it. I saw something on the news the other day that was talking about Florida, and they were saying, and I'm sure somebody's gonna correct me because I'll get this all wrong, but they were saying that you can no longer even have trainings or in schools talk about anything that makes white folks feel uncomfortable. And I remember I was watching it on CNN, and they definitely highlighted the word uncomfortable. And they just spent like 30 minutes just talking about how it would make people feel uncomfortable. And I was like, wow, that is, so I don't think that is progress or any steps in the right direction. When I see what happened on January 6th, last year, it doesn't give me very much hope for folks. And Crystal, I appreciate your preface when you spoke earlier, because as a social worker, we have to believe that people have the capacity for change. But some people, you just got to let them be where they at.
Bless their heart.
Yeah, it is. It is. Those are the ones. And it doesn't stop us from trying, but I think our job is to put the food on the table for the nourishment of their bodies. And if they decide to eat it, great. And if not, they have the right to self-determination. But I just think that when I see just this pushback of what I watched on January 6th, there was a lot of folks saying that this is our country, we want it back. We don't like the browning of America. We don't like the direction that it's going in. And in the spirit of Black History Month, Malcolm X had a quote. I saw it was a short snippet, and he was being interviewed by a news reporter. And the news reporter, I don't know what year it was, but the news reporter says, like, hey, don't you think we're making progress though? We're making good progress, right? And Malcolm X kind of chuckled and he said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6, is that progress? No, that's not progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. Progress is only made when the healing part begins, that the wound that the knife created, that wound that the knife created begins to heal. And then he goes on to say, we have people in America that they won't even admit that the knife is there. And I feel like that was said probably in the 50s or early 60s. And we still have the same problem today that we were talking about back then. So it's like we're still fighting the same fight that my father was fighting, that my grandfather was fighting, that my great-grandfather was fighting. So I would love to see some of these systems become broken down and not just so much a focus on individual cases. I think it's great that the people who killed Ahmaud Arbery is going to prison, but I don't think that is justice. I think justice is us being in a place where he wouldn't have been chased, hunted down, and killed in the first place. So that's pretty much all I'll say on that. I won't go on a rant because I can tirade for days. I'm sorry.
My feet are underneath the desk doing a little church dance, a little church shuffle. But I want to wake up a few things that you said. When you talked about January 6th, I remember that day I was in my office watching it on TV, and I was watching Fox News, and Tucker Carlson was on TV saying that what we're seeing here is a bunch of patriots that didn't feel heard. And because they didn't feel heard, this is the result of that. And Martin Luther King had a similar statement, right? Through the voices of the unheard, right? So I agreed with him. I honestly did. They didn't feel heard and they took it to the Capitol and they destroyed stuff. How easy is it for us to justify actions for some while we completely dehumanize others and we call them savages and animals and we paint them the way we painted them in Birth of a Nation? The conversation switched, and I loved it, from trying to think of instances to seeing it as what it is. It's a systemic issue. So when we have these incidental wins, we have a guilty verdict for George Floyd, we have for Derek Chauvin, we have a guilty verdict for those who killed Ahmaud Arbery. We celebrate that, but that has been conflated with justice, and it's not justice, right? Justice would have prevented it from happening in the first place because you would have had that decency to know this is a life just as your life and the life you birthed. But that doesn't exist. So it's looking at this broader image of what systems are currently in place that cause us to see this as an acceptable practice. So we don't even think twice about chasing someone down who's running down a street and then shooting them down dead in the ground, and then for the attorney to say, but he was wearing no socks with his sneakers and his nails were long and dirty. So not only did we kill him, but even in his death, we strip him of any dignity that could possibly exist. But that's the justice system at work. So I know you mentioned that Florida has, and leave my Florida alone, we got hope. But we have a few bills that are in both the House and the Senate. We have House Bill 7, House Bill 57, State Bill 148, but they center around this space of individual freedom and race and sexual discrimination. And as you mentioned, it is out to say, if you are in a space and you feel like the training that is mandated for you to have licensure or credentialing, for you to have a position or for you to maintain that position, if you feel like this training that is mandatory is going to make you feel uncomfortable because it's promoting CRT or it is promoting education on diversity, equity, and inclusion, social emotional learning is snuck in the middle of it, you have the right to say no. And if you choose to say no and your employer is mandated, you can sue. So the employer is held responsible, and also the consultant doing the work is also held responsible because they're promoting discriminatory practices. But it goes back to what I said earlier, this rush to stop the discomfort, this rush to pacify people with false lies of we have overcome and we've advanced, we pulled the 9-inch blade out 6 inches. Why are they still complaining? Look how far you've gotten. You flipped a state, you had a Black president, you've gotten so far, you don't need any more. When you have to tell people that you still own the right to breathe and you deserve that, justice can exist. So that's the part that needs to shift. How do we impact those policies so that they don't come into practice? Because July 1st, 2022, those are coming on the books. The same is true for this what is it, the ballot amendment to get the majority to really be a supermajority, moving from an already high 60% of electoral votes to 66.67%. And it's not lost on me that in 2018, Amendment 4 passed at 65%. So how do we stop this from happening? How do we stop disparities? How do we stop truly inclusive spaces and mindsets and we stop it at the ballot. You got 65, but will you get 66.67% of the vote? So that's where it has to shift. Yes, as professionals and as practitioners, we have to have this lens so that we can provide that fair and equitable treatment and that fair and equitable practice. But if we're doing it, but the laws on the books are still saying that, nope, you don't have to, who's really going to do it and who's going to be willing to take the risk? None of these strategies are new. It's always been the same. We will scare you into staying in your place, right? Don't move from that space, which is why the work that David does with amplifying narratives is so important, because not all, but some, if they truly knew the stories behind what they're doing and the impact it causes, then we'll start seeing some subtle shifts.
So I want to jump in here for a second, because you guys, like I couldn't have scripted any of this better for segues into questions that I want to ask. And David, you mentioned criminal justice, social work, and mental health. I want to add to that education and institutions of education, which is not lost in much of what you've alluded to about how we are educated and acculturated into beliefs that we have and how we learn those. And were it not for the education system, we would not be having this conversation here as we are today. And so I want to shift, if I can, our conversation a bit, because we know that and we've alluded to the contradictions inherent in these institutions of authority, right? In schools, in mental health, in courts, in prisons, in hospitals, in all of these, and how difficult it is to reconcile these with these notions of justice with which we opened up. So what I'd like to do is invite you to speak about an example of a time that you've seen this and how you in your specific area of work or practice have approached and perhaps transformed this. You've seen what I'm going to use the shorthand using the language of justice and injustice, and I know that it's shorthand. How you have seen injustice and how you have, in your own work, moved to transform that or shift that conversation. Can you speak a bit about some of your experiences and your practices in that area? And again, I invite anybody who would like to open up to do so. Well, I don't need to direct it. You guys are perfectly capable of speaking for yourselves. And if you don't, I will direct it.
So let me lean in first, because so what I would offer, Mar, is a remembrance about a nested theory, right? The idea that injustice that exists at the international level has an interpreted injustice that's existing at the national, at the state, regional, local, family, and interpersonal level. And so we all are dealing with injustice and trying to address it at different levels. And so when you're trying to shift narratives around, you're not even doing, it's like some people do work that's at the fruit of the tree, the fruit of an unjust system, or some people are working at the systems level, at the trunk or even the root. And narrative work is really the dirt work, right? And so we're changing systems, and we're changing even the ground that nurtures a variety of unjust systems. Even in the midst of that, for instance, having a conversation, Greensboro, North Carolina, having a conversation between police officers, local government, local activists, members of Black Lives Matter, the Latin Kings and Queens, and a number of others, and doing a long conversation to ask, how do we create a Greensboro in which everyone feels safe, protected, and respected? Like that, to some extent, invites what everybody is seeking. And in order to do that, you have to begin shifting narrative. So narrative shifts at a slow, very incremental level. There can be some small, intermittent, and interpersonal changes, but then it's a constant, it becomes habit. The narratives that we live in that guide our lives, that shape the stories of our lives, are habitual. And so there are a variety of these ways in which it's a slow and glacial thing. So I'm taking the longest view of how this justice thing will shift, how injustices shift to a different understanding. And others, I imagine, are doing it at different levels within that nesting. And so I would invite others to talk about, at the state, regional, systemic, and interpersonal level.
Go ahead, Drew. Okay, I want to jump in here with my hat as a social work educator on and speak to some of the need to shift narratives within social work and how students are indoctrinated within that system and educated within that system. And I think part of that is about the critically examining the way we name and claim our practice and pull apart some of these tensions. When we think about social work as this caring, caring, nurturing practice, we're missing the social control piece that David mentioned earlier. And so we've got to grapple with that tension of how is it that something we call a practice of care is so bound up and complicit with social control? How is it that when we, on the one hand, are about analyzing systems that tend to retain and impose both interpersonal and structural violence in people's lives, why is it that most of the theory and practice in social work is still about changing people, identifying deficits as if they exist in the person? And so we focus on all these person changing endeavors rather than systems changing endeavors. And how is it that we look to our practice and claim that it's problematic to be, quote, political? If we're fundamentally political, and we've got to claim that, we're not neutral in this world. And so I think in social work, we have to find ways to help students be able to talk about power and powerlessness and to articulate the politics of practice. They have to be able to analyze meanings and the way things are named and claimed. I mean, we quit talking about a child welfare system and started naming it as a family surveillance system. Would we look at it differently? And when instead of talking about criminal justice, when we're talking about the carceral state, we're naming something very differently and then looking at it differently. And then that gives us different ways to think about those contexts of our practice. I think we, within social work, have been negligent in understanding history and understanding the history of our own practices and the deep roots of where most of the theory is that we've drawn from comes from. And until we have a greater critical historical consciousness, we're prone to historical amnesia, and that's highly problematic. And I think by learning to to rename and reclaim, to think differently, to analyze power, to critically look to history, that opens our spaces of possibility in our practice.
So, Janet, what you just spoke about made me think of a quote that I saw on Instagram, and I want to give this social worker credit. His name is Oliver. His name is like Mount Oliver Social Worker or something like that on Instagram. So follow him. He's awesome. He puts out a lot of great content. He says something around, I'm sure I'll mess this up, but he said, if you're focused on helping clients but not working to dismantle systems that failed them, you are part of the problem. And so it really just spoke volumes to me, because in the social work world, you have like this LCSW versus MSW or LMSW. And a lot of people are very focused on micro practice, like, oh, I'm a psychotherapist. I do micro practice, I do private practice, I do this. And I feel like the main difference between social work and other mental health disciplines is the social justice, the social and economic justice piece, the advocacy piece. And in social work, they'll tell you advocate, like that's the word, that's the social work term, is advocate. But in our work as social workers, and particularly at my job, you have to sometimes demand. It's great to advocate for clients, and you are doing that, but sometimes you have to approach it with a certain vigor that comes across a little more, on a higher level. So at my job, we respond to 911 calls that come in that are related to mental health. So in Rochester, New York, where I'm from, where I am now, there was a man, Daniel Prude, who in April, a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago now, he was a naked Black man outside. If you don't know, in New York, it's still snowing in April. So it was snowing outside. It was around 3 a.m. He clearly was having some type of behavioral health issue to be naked outside, wandering around the streets in the city at 3 a.m. The police came in contact with him, and it's even difficult to talk about because it was very triggering to watch this. And so when you talk about mental health, you can't help but mention the vicarious trauma or secondary trauma that we see as watching people who look like us brutalized by the people that are paid to protect them. We pay tax dollars to folks that are brutalizing us, so that has to be said. But a long story short, this Black man was taken into custody. He was put in handcuffs, face down, and on the ground, butt naked in the snow. They didn't give him a blanket or anything. The officers proceeded to put a bag over his head, a spit mask, I think is the proper term. And then they started to choke him to the point where you could see some type of bodily liquid coming out of his mouth. He was starting to throw up. At this point, you would think they would stop choking him, who was very non-resistant. I have to mention that, not that resistance would justify the choking him, and even though some would argue it would. He was not combative at all, but he was choked. He died in police custody. The police fabricated this story and said he died of a drug overdose. The citizens of Rochester, New York did not know about this until August, months and months later. They all had it on body cam footage. We didn't see it. It was a cover-up. Because that happened, there was outrage in Rochester. And if you don't know about Rochester, Rochester is the third largest city in New York, behind New York City and Buffalo. And when people get upset, when you talk about, I don't even want to call it a riot, and I won't call it a riot. I will call it a rebellion, because they were tired of seeing the state-sanctioned violence that we've seen in our community and communities in other places all across the country. But he died very similarly to George Floyd. Because of that, folks got together, protested, marched, and they put so much pressure on local government that they created a person in crisis team. They created the first mental health first responder team in the state of New York. It didn't have anything to do with votes. I wouldn't say anything to do with votes, but it wasn't that people went into a ballot box and they voted. everybody, they shut down City Hall in Rochester because the pressure they put. They went into the biggest grocery stores and protested, shut down grocery stores. They caused such a ruckus, which is what you have to do in social work to make change, that this is how my job was created. It literally happened so fast. It just happened so fast that they were like, we have to shut down our city hall for days because people camped at the city hall. So when we start to talk about justice, I think that's what it looks like. But to my point about when you have to demand justice, I think those folks demanded that justice by protesting, by marching, by going to the officers' houses and protesting and dancing. They had a whole Black celebration in some of the officers' driveways, the mayor's driveway. So I think we just sometimes have to cause a little bit of a ruckus in order to see change. We can't always be gentle. It won't always take therapeutic modalities. Sometimes it's going to take going outside, putting boots to the ground, lobbying, and really forcefully making the change that we wish to see.
If I can jump in real fast. Dre, you mentioned vicarious trauma, and just in case people don't know what it is, it's trauma that you feel at just watching, observing. It didn't directly happen to you. The incident wasn't to you specifically, but you were just exposed to it, whether in the media, whether hearing secondhand accounts, seeing it wherever you feel that same feeling almost as the person that it directly happened. The moment of vulnerability, my father was missing last week. I got a call from him and he was terrified in his car. He was hallucinating and couldn't place where he was. He was calling my daughter's phone thinking he was calling me, and she heard how dysregulated he sounded and gave me the phone, and he's just terrified. I don't want to die like this. I don't want to die like this. I'm like, Pops, I'm coming. Just tell me what you see. And all he could tell me was marathon. I'm running a marathon. That caused me to think, shoot, marathon gas station. Let's GPS every marathon gas station. And I'm scouring St. Lucie County, going into Indian River County, trying to find my dad. I left my house without shoes. That's how triggered I was in that moment. And everything in me said, call 911. They'll ping his phone, they'll find him. You don't understand the fear that gripped me in that moment to pick up the phone and dial for him. Because I heard my dad's voice, and I heard how just he was not himself. And I knew in that moment, if he was approached by the wrong person, I would be responsible for my father. That is that vicarious trauma. We don't get to see this every single day and it not shape the way we respond, better yet, the way we react. It took me about 45 minutes to call them, and they said no, because he hadn't been missing for 24 hours. So I used my relationships with people, and they were able to ping his phone, and we found him. And even when they found him, the first responding officer, when my friend was there, because I ended up all the way by you, Mara, trying to find this man. But my best friend calls me like, I don't care what you have to do, get here now, because this cop, and as she said that, the cop pulled the phone from her and said, well, your dad is being belligerent and he's obstructing justice. So we can tell that he's intoxicated, because before you got there, you already diagnosed the issue. And I asked her where was her licensure from that caused her to be able to assess a person's mental state. And she started to become quiet. That's what people endure every single day. And if they're not as articulate or as informed as I am, they will take to the streets. And what people fail to realize is they didn't start by going to the streets first. They started in the churches and in the pews that you told them to go to, and they started praying. And they got tired of praying, so they took to the streets, because you can't have your knee on someone's neck indefinitely for centuries and not expect them to react. We move past response, we move to react, because cortisol has now replaced every degree of blood that rushes through us. I want to go back to something that, I don't remember which one of y'all said it. I just jotted some notes down, y'all, bear with me. I think you said it, Dre, where you were talking about the quote from the social worker on Facebook. And I love to say we talk about resilience, but why aren't we talking about what caused the adversity? stop putting the work on me. Stop putting the work on community. They had to become resilient because you caused them to experience adversity that lasted generations and went into the next generation like hand-me-down genes. If we're not going to address the system and the root of the adversity that is being produced, don't put this extra burden on people to grow resilience. Resilience is overrated. We don't need it. We need change. We need it to become normalized that people are treated like people. So Mara, you asked specifically of something that we've done and how we've seen the shift. And the only thing I could think of right now, because all of this brought me back to my dad, was I worked with an organization and we were doing executive coaching, and I spent a lot of time working with leaders to cultivate their emotional intelligence. And in one of our group coaching sessions, someone mentioned that a specific person on her team is just, her work ethic was poor. That's how she described the person. And I asked her, was it always this way? Did she always do this? She said, no, she switched it up on us, because when she came in, she did everything and everything seemed so great, but all of a sudden her work just started to just deteriorate, and her affect switched and her attitude shifted, and she's difficult to work with now. But no one ever questioned, what did she walk into? How toxic was your environment? And she just got sick. And when people get sick, their behaviors change, the way they present shifts. But it's easier to blame the person, blame the employee. But similar to what you said, Janet, we have to name it to tame it. But if you're naming it, work ethic is poor, and your poor attitude, and you're difficult to work with, you want to extinguish that thing instead of seeing it as she's sick because we have poisoned her with our corporate jewel and the corporate trauma that exists. But making that shift and asking that question opened up some doors for some meaningful, very meaningful dialogue that caused them to see things that they would have never explored. You keep doing community engagement or corporate engagement events, but you're doing it on nights where she doesn't have a babysitter, so she has to pay $70 for a babysitter to come and stay with the kids, while you are taking her to a place where she has to pay for food and has to pay for drinks if she's gonna feel like she fits in. But you're paying her the lowest amount on your team. So not only are you making it difficult, you are causing her to feel like this social outcast because she can't do what you want her to do. And you're doing this repeatedly, but you expect her to show up with a smile? That simple thing, that simple observation, those simple questions where we're truly curious. We don't go in experts knowing everything. We go in curious, trying to figure it out. That caused so much relief for that person. And did it completely transform the organization? No, but it did set them on the path. So what else don't we know? There is so much power. David said he does the dirt, the soil work, and that's where it starts. It's not watering the leaves. It's not shining the apple on the tree to give the impression that good work is being done. It's truly getting to the soil and figuring out what's the pH level here? What kind of weeds are here? Is it fertilized? Doing that work. You don't get to become a justice person if your nails are clean. You have to get to the root of everything. You have to get messy. You have to feel the contractions, because if you don't have contractions, you won't know when to push. If you don't know when to push, you won't give birth to the new.
Can I, thank you for that. I want to ask you two things. One, is there, in light of the previous question about how your work has transformed in some community or some institution, I want to ask two questions, and they're a little related. One question is where you have chosen to step back because you see an institution or an environment where you don't believe justice can be, or justice as we're talking about it, can be accomplished, and why. And I want to invite David, I'm going to get this all wrong, but in this conversation about roots and groundwater, I know there's another conversation that we've had that you've explored and been thinking about it that I'm going to mess up if I try and say, but I think you know the one I'm talking about. with the soil and the roots and the other word that you had that I'm forgetting right now. So I want to invite you to bring that into this conversation, and I will try and remember it better. I'm sorry, I'm killing it. And also then invite, because I know some of you, there are moments when you choose not to engage, when trying to engage will not further the expression of justice in an institution or in a community. And I wonder if you have examples or experiences of that as well.
So I think we're talking about the rhizomatic nature of some of this oppression, right?
Yes.
And so the notion of the rhizome is that it's multiply connected root system. So you can't just pull out a thing at the root because it spreads. And so every so often something pops up. And so the same, the dirt gives rise to and nurtures systems. So an education system pops up, a prison industrial system pops up, a social work system pops up, a healthcare system pops up, an economic and employment system pops up, all of them having the same logic, right? And all of them being animated. They all have different structures, but they're all animated and nurtured by the same logic that accepts marginalization, that accepts the diminishment of people based on certain arbitrary characteristics. And so when you try to reform a system, if you don't understand the narrative that creates that system, then it's like whack-a-mole, right? And so I'm a trained lawyer. I've stepped away from legal arenas because people believe that if you change the law, you can, change the way that people behave and change the way that people relate. And to some extent that's true, but there's an underlying logic to the law that continues to marginalize and give permission to diminish certain people and to prioritize property over people, particularly over certain kinds of people. And so we have to change that logic at that level, at the dirt level. That's why I'm saying I'm constantly going back to working at the dirt level. You can't pull up a rhizome. Anybody who knows anything about kudzu knows that you'll start pulling kudzu in Jacksonville and you'll be somewhere in Charlotte before you get to the end of it because it's all connected. It's like that. You can't do it. So how do we pull back and see the systems and begin to not just go against the systems, because going against them gives them life? How do we create alternative systems that people can live into, that you can choose to live into different ways of being? And you know that alternative systems are dangerous because every time somebody tries to create one, they get attacked really heavily, right? For creating alternative systems is almost as dangerous as attacking the system itself. And so critical race theory is one thing. Alternative schools is a whole nother thing. When people start building their own alternative school networks, that gets attacked even more than critical race theory.
Okay, I'll jump in here. So where I've had to step back at first, Mara, when you asked the question, I'm like, I don't step back unless I'm playing basketball. My foot is always on the gas. So I was really challenged. So I'm glad that David took this first, because I was like, step back. They telling me, Dre, you need to calm down. You need to slow down. And you always trying to rock the boat. So I really thought about it. And as David spoke, he made me think of where I've had to step back. Not had to, I guess I should say, chose to. So I've been blessed with the opportunity to create and facilitate professional development and host workshops in many states, in New York, in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, and even a couple in Florida. So it's something I'm very passionate about. I love to do. I just got done with a workshop last Saturday, really good time. But where I've had to step back is I've had a lot of opportunities present themselves to train police departments. And if I said yes, I'll be making good money. I'll be doing great. But I said no because I have no interest in doing that. I don't buy into that system. I don't believe that system. So it is something that I turn down regularly. I just don't think that dumping more money into already the highest paid municipality in just about any city that I can think of is the answer. I don't think that that's the key. If I just wanted a money grab, I would do it. But it's just not something I'm interested in. I don't think they can have the skills that we have in an 8-hour training. It is just not possible. It's not even realistic to ask. And so I'm almost, I don't want to say disrespected when I'm asked to do it, but it's just something that it's a hard no on training police departments on how to do the job that we do. I think it would be like, I think I'm a pretty intelligent person, but if neurologists wanted to try and train me on neurology in 8 hours and think I could perform some type of surgery on someone, I would say, I don't think that's a good idea. I won't be equipped to handle that task. And so I don't think that police are equipped to handle the task that we have. So that's definitely an area where, you know, I've had to step back and kind of just say, yeah, you know, I don't think that that's for me. So that's something where I've kind of had to step back in this work.
I apologize for that technical glitch, folks.
I noticed your background changed, Mark. If I have to explore where I step back, and I tend to do it a lot. So I don't know, I guess I passed the ball, Dre. But I realized, especially in this season of DEI, where everyone uses it, every agency has a DEI task force, DEI committee. There is a lot of interest in doing these one-off workshops. And I don't know how many times I have to say it. Research shows implicit bias trainings, they don't work. I'm sorry, folks. It doesn't. Because what it does oftentimes is it opens Pandora's box. You have someone come in, you give them a very brief amount of time to explore this really huge concept. So they end up coming in doing more harm than good. They don't work. And then after they leave, now you have this increased amount of stress and tension, which is why we have people running for these bills saying, stop these from being mandatory trainings, because they come in and they mess up what's working because it was good before, because you had compliance and you had code switching and all of that. So for me, I tend to step back from that. If you truly do not have skin in the game, if you truly do not prioritize your human capital and you are trying to get this done the quickest, cheapest, easiest way by just slapping a workshop so you can check the box, then I am not your person. And maybe it could turn into something where years later you're able to say, yep, I'm ready now to do something more. But I have to be able to sleep at night knowing that I came into an environment where someone without a voice, without access to power, is going to be put in an even worse position, because now no more work needs to get done because we are trained up till 2023 because of this 1 hour training this lady just came in and did. So when I realized that your intention is more transactional based, where I have to argue with you over my prices, chabu, I can't do it. No. If you don't see this as an investment, but you see it as an expense, I have to step away. And I think a lot of people, especially in the schools, I'm gonna throw it out there in Marna, who I'm talking about, but I see a lot of people doing that, where we want to create these great programs so we can take the pictures of the students being helped by community members coming in that they will never see again. That is not mentorship. Stop labeling it as mentoring. You have people come in and they teach kids how to do this one thing one day and you slap a title on it as mentoring. What you're doing to that kid is a kid that is starving for connection. You tease them with it. You get them to feel like someone cares and he's talking to me and calling me by name and she's asking me questions and she's getting me to feel special, and then she never comes back in. Again, we are not only just ripping open the wound, we're stabbing it with an ice pick and then we're putting salt on it like the rim of a margarita glass. We're doing harm. So those are the spaces that I choose to step back from, because I won't be complicit in the harm that you cause.
Thank you. Earlier in this conversation, we alluded, I think, Crystal, it was you used also the term transactional. And we've talked before about the notions of interacting transactionally and interacting transformatively. When we speak about justice, we are often, I think, dealing with a transactional system, and perhaps what we are aspiring to is a transformational system, or transformational systems generally within how we conceive of systems being just. Can I invite any of you to speak to that distinction? Perhaps Janet, can I invite you to join in and talk a bit about sort of concepts of transaction and transformation and how we move justice forward in that context?
I guess when I think about that, I think about the risks of back to intent and effect, perhaps in some ways, and well-intentioned efforts that haven't been critically thought through or engaged with more broadly. We get into the tension and contradiction space where an effort ends up being allied with these large embedded systems that David was addressing that have such deep roots and deep history and deep ways of thinking and doing and being. And when you try to make a change that is at a more subsystem level and it's not affecting the overall system, it may end up being window dressing, and the overall system and its logic and its force stays unmoved. And I think that's that sense in my mind of where things become transactional and co-opted. The best intended efforts can be so readily co-opted as they're sucked in as a component within an existing system based on these logics and structures of structural violence, of inequity, of masked harm doing. And so I think that's my sense. I love Crystal's use of transaction and performance as opposed to transformational. And so it seems to me we have to, again, approach with that humility and transparency about what is it that becomes then transformational, and what's that risk of co-optation, even with some of the best intended restorative justice efforts, as if they become arms of the existing criminal justice system or the existing education system or the existing child welfare system. Are they the little cogs moving while the big machine stays in place? And so I think those, to me, are these deep tensions that we have to really be grappling with, because co-optation is such a real risk.
So when I think of transactional, I'll use it as this. My husband comes home every couple of days from work, and if it's a bad week, my house gets cleaned in 5 minutes. Everything gets tossed somewhere, but it is out of view. And he comes home to a house that looks like I slaved over it. So I have the excuse to say, tag, you're it, you deal with these 3 kids. It gives the appearance of, while nothing was done. The place is still a hot mess, but to the first glance, it's clean, right? It's all spick and span. I think it is that knee-jerk response to something to quiet versus doing that deep dive, that assessment of what caused it to begin with. If your work starts off with, hey, let's do this, it's transactional, because you're just rushing to fix. You're not rushing to understand. It has to start with that assessment piece so you can figure out what's happening, what's the problem, what caused the problem, who is impacted by the problem, and what needs to shift in order for the problem to solve. And if we choose to do nothing, the cost of inaction is X, Y, Z. And if you don't have measures in there for accountability, if you don't have a way of measuring your impact, if that's not built into it, you're looking at that transactional piece, because you truly don't care about impact. You just want to be able to say, I'm doing this to do it. So those are some key pieces. It's the golden rule versus the platinum rule. The golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But the platinum rule says, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. They have to be included in it. You can't have justice without sharing power. So when we start bringing in the true experts, the people living in the situations we're trying to address, If they're not at the table, if they don't have the bullhorn, we don't have it, and it will continue to remain transactional. But the truth is, and don't hate me for saying this, y'all, Mara invited me, we want transactional. The system wasn't designed for transformation. If transformation happens, the system is broken. If every person sitting in a jail cell right now said, I do not waive my right to trial, take me to court, what happens to our justice system? It breaks. It was designed for a transactional, everyday, move it along, rubber stamp bureaucracy. That's all we were built for. So this notion of abolishing these systems and these structures will never go over well with people because it is tied to their bottom line. And no one wants to shake that up. That's why you had reparations for white slave owners that lost plantation land, but free blacks are ending up getting it with their 40 acres. Like that's the honest truth of it. And that's why it's uncomfortable. But it's uncomfortable if it's not aligned with your core values. But if it is, you should be just as outraged as I am and as other people on this channel. So that's how I view the difference between.
I want to give a little time to, oh, I'm sorry, Dre, you were going to jump in. I'm going to
Sorry,
jump
I
back.
will be as brief as possible. I think that transformation begins with reimagining. I think it was David that mentioned like change won't come from laws. It has to come from the hearts and minds of people. That's where the change has to happen, because you can have, I mean, they banned and outlawed chokeholds for police, and we still saw chokeholds on people several years after. They still continued to happen. The laws changed and it still continued to happen because you had a culture already built in this fraternity of policing where it was already acceptable, and they didn't think that it was something that was too much. It wasn't something that they were giving up. So I feel like we have to start reimagining and thinking outside of the box. And so I think we saw when a gentleman, Rayshard Brooks, was murdered by police in a Wendy's parking lot. We watched the footage of this on national news where the man was drinking, fell asleep in a Wendy's parking lot. They called the police. The police show up, interview him for 45 minutes. When you watch that interview, you see they were going to take him to jail. It didn't matter what he said. He could have been a Harvard professor. He was going to jail. There was no way around it because of the transactions that come at the cost of him and his freedom. And so when he said, my sister lives down the street, I can just walk down the street. I won't even try. I had one too many to drink. I didn't want to get behind the wheel of my car. I fell asleep. I could just walk down to my sister's house. They were like, oh, no. Take a breathalyzer. He's like, I don't need to, because I've already told you that I've been drinking and I'm under the influence. So when we think about reimagining police or reimagining public safety, and someone says defund, everybody gets upset. Like, oh no, you can't say that. Don't say that. Oh, no. Everybody wants to tone police you when you say defund police because they're so connected to police. We've been so indoctrinated by what some folks refer to as propaganda of what we see on TV. But I feel like everybody loves to wear Malcolm X t-shirts, but people are not really about that radical and revolutionary transformation. People aren't really, if Malcolm X was alive, he's probably rolling over in his grave right now. So I think that we really have to get out of the conformity and groupthink and actually start thinking about public safety. And in the example with Rayshard Brooks, I bring that up because I remember watching that. And when we talk about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, it brought tears to my eyes to see this happen, where they were about to try and arrest him and he ran and they shot him in his back 2 times and shot an innocent vehicle in the process, where kids were in the back of that vehicle that they shot. They were just shooting like cavaliers or cowboys in the Wild Wild West to try and stop this man who had done what? Fell asleep in his car drunk. I think most people, if we're being honest and keeping it real, most people have had a glass of wine or a beer or whatever and driven home from a bar or a restaurant or Applebee's. To say that he needed to go to jail, I think that was just a bit much for me when I watched that. And I thought, if I'm reimagining public safety, what would that look like? And I thought, well, if they did defund the police and create a team very similar to the PIC team that we have now in New York, and they had social workers that came out, and we could have made an assessment, which is what we do now, and say, hey, Mr. Brooks, what's going on? Oh, I've had one too many. The man needed an Uber ride home. Instead, he got bullets in his back. And then you still have people that wanted to argue why it was justified. Well, he tried to run. Well, he did grab the taser from the police officer. Well, I mean, he kind of had it coming. Why are we defending Black life? And so when someone says Black lives matter, people get offended. They say, what about blue lives? Well, what about all lives? So I think that that's very interesting. So again, I think we have to go back to the hearts and minds of folks, and we really have to start pushing for radical revolutionary change. That's where transformation begins, thinking outside the box and creating programs very similar to the one where we actually had a woman who did the exact same thing. And our team was called out to the scene, and where police wanted to take her to jail, I was like, no, we can call her a lift and get her home. And we were able to do that. It literally, that was the first call I had at this job that actually brought tears to my eyes, because I thought a Black man literally died the same exact way. And our team just got a person to ride the same way. I was thinking in my mind, I saw this in my mind of what it should be, and now it is here. So it was really like a full circle moment where I was like, wow, I really I guess I have been manifesting it this whole time, but it was something that when the opportunity presented itself to move from Florida, where I was living, to move back to Rochester for this program, it was something I definitely jumped on. And I'm proud to be able to work on a team that's new, innovative, and groundbreaking. So that's all I had to say. Sorry, that wasn't as short as I wanted to.
No, that wasn't short, but great, nonetheless. I want to make sure we get to some audience questions, and we are.
1 minute, Mara. I'm sorry. I
Okay.
promise. I don't even really take the 1 minute. I won't. Can I switch out your radical for innovative? Radical sounds like we're gonna burn stuff, and that I think drives fear.
If that's what it takes, burning down Target, then I'm all for it. We gotta
So
do what we
Drew,
gotta do.
and I'm with you there.
For
But
property.
I think when people realize that, they agree. So innovative, we celebrate. We want innovative ideas. And that is the same exact thing he's talking about when he says radical. We're not asking for anything that you wouldn't do if it wasn't yours and your family. It is the same. I just want to make that connection for people. We are not asking for anything that anyone else wouldn't do. So when you hear radical, see innovative, it's not just Malcolm X, it's Martin Luther King. He said, I had a dream, and then 3 years later, he said that dream was actually a nightmare because it was laced in reality, in optimism instead of being laced in reality. So when you think of radical, just understand all we're saying is we want to try something new and innovative. And that's how, for centuries, we've evolved as a people. We have to innovate, or else, keep walking around with the BlackBerry in the next town.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge also that we are at 6:50 and this conversation is slated to go till 7. Sometimes these conversations are more in depth and they take longer. So for those who can, if you choose to get off at 7, that's absolutely fine. And for those who would like to stay for another 15 minutes, and if our panelists are able to do that, I invite them to do so. But I just want to acknowledge time and be respectful of everyone's time as well. And so in that, a question was asked, what are the responsibilities of the individual in regard to issues of social justice? And when is the restriction of freedom a good thing?
Individuals have a responsibility for self-awareness, for relationality, for pursuing the full manifestation of their capabilities to the extent that it doesn't impede the full manifestation of anyone else's capabilities. And when it does, then that's where you have to spend some time establishing a new narrative, a narrative of a shared future that, to the extent possible, allows everybody to flourish. Freedom, most people don't actually want freedom, and so there's no reason to ask about the limits of freedom. What most people want is constraints for everybody else that allows them to do what they want to do. And that's not freedom, because freedom is completely inextricably connected to responsibility. Freedom only exists within a society. Freedom doesn't exist independent of your social responsibility to the rest, to the collective. And so what are the limits? To talk about individual freedom, there's not a limit on individual freedom because freedom's not an individual concept. Freedom is something that you can only construct as a collective. I'll put a pin in it. I'll stop there.
I know there's so much more to say on this. I want to make sure to get to a question that a number of students have asked. David, I think it was you who alluded earlier to dirt work or dirt level work. It may not have been you, and forgive me if I've confused that. Could you give, or anyone, give some more examples of what you mean by that work?
So when I'm talking about dirt work, like if you look at the practices, if you go into an organization and you look at the practices, the policies, the way that the budget is constructed, the relational practices within the organization, that's systems. Structures, what are the structures that make that happen, that perpetuate that? But then beneath those structures, there are narratives, there are metaphors and myths that cause those structures to come about. There are no structures that exist organically or naturally. Structures exist to perpetuate particular narratives. And so the idea of the dirt work is to uncover the narratives that those systems, the metaphors and the myths that those systems are being true to, those systems are perpetuating, and then determine what narratives we actually want to live into, and figure out how then to best restructure relationships, resources, systems, and I say testimonial authority, like who it is that has, who gets listened to, whose word gets honored in these systems. In a child welfare system, if you don't honor the word of children, then that's not you've denied them testimonial authority, which means they can't be fully participants. And so you have to undo, but the narrative of child welfare is that there's an ageism that suggests that adults in a patriarchal and hierarchical system have a better knowledge of what is needed than the child does for their life, right? How do you construct ways? So you have to change that narrative. So the dirt work is in uncovering the narratives, the myths, the metaphors that are the genesis of the system and that get carried through by the way that systems and structures are organized. And then from there, redoing systems and structures in line with new narratives. That's dirt work.
Thank you. I want to make sure, as we wind down this conversation, though, for those who can stay and who may want to, I want to thank our panelists. I want to make sure also to talk about the survey that needs to be done in order to get credit for this. So you will get a survey link. There will be a short survey that will be sent out to you that, I'm sorry, I have a script for and I didn't see it, so I'm going to be straight up about that. There's a 1-minute survey and it's right in the chat. So before you go, if you could just make sure to click on that link so that we can get some feedback before people start having to leave. If they do, if you would just make sure to click on that link, that would be really helpful. So, and thank you. We've got 4 minutes. I'm going to ask you one more question and then wrap up for a bit. And then for those who would like to stay, invite you to do so for another 10 or 15 minutes. How did your own discipline-based education dismantle versus sustain injustice? What should be our next steps as practitioners? I think, Janet, you alluded to this earlier, way early in the conversation, but perhaps you could return to that and address a bit about that discipline-based education and where it either, dismantles or sustains injustice.
Sure. I think one of the things I see that still has a stronghold in social work is this division of social work into micro and macro practice. And I think that's a false dichotomy. And I think it's highly problematic because it allows those who gravitate toward clinical work to operate under the false belief that their work is apolitical and it's person changing only. And then they strip out the whole context of the larger structure of people's lives. And they operate on these very narrow psychologized views and interventions. And they lose sight of the fact that injustice permeates the most intimate of clinical settings. And then the sort of the off the hook response is, well, the macro folks handle social justice. And that's where that false dichotomy is so problematic, as if social justice is only to be handled by those who are trained in advocacy and action. We as a profession have to come together and look at the integration of the ways that injustice permeates to the deepest part of the fabric of people's beings and causes pain and trauma and perpetuates that. And we have to have the skills and the knowledge and the capacity and the willingness to take action, to be agents of resistance, agents of advocacy, and as Dre was talking about earlier, agents to really take bold and courageous action and make demands. And I don't think we train social workers to do that. I don't think I was trained that way, and I feel like I'm still in a process of, rather than stepping back, as you asked earlier about, I feel it's it's time for, especially those of us who've had all the insularity of white privilege, it's time to step up and engage our practice in different ways.
We've got 1 minute. I'm going to ask a hard question, and then I'm going to thank our panelists and allow people to jump off if they want to and stay if we can. Can you address how sometimes universities can make the things we've been discussing tonight worse? Things like being physically located close to neighborhoods where inequities exist due to historical systemic redlining, education, home ownership, and I'm going to add to that food poverty, lack of access to health resources, all of those things that make it difficult to engage, and where universities may hinder rather than help that. And you got 1 minute.
Really simply, universities, in order to be affordable, right now the systems are they have a cover that suggests that they're affordable. Even the universities that are $60,000 and $70,000 a year would cost more if they paid their people a living wage. And so they don't do that. And so they have to so most universities sit inside of communities, or they need a community close enough by where people are struggling to survive, so that they will think of coming to the university to work and not coming to the university to study and set themselves up. So in most places, universities are keystone institutions, and they are designed to maintain systematic poverty and marginalization so that they can have a pipeline of people who will work to make it affordable for the gentry that otherwise come to sit in those seats.
So then they add on the sweet part at the end. You get free tuition for your kids.
Right. Thank you.
And I would say universities operate an awful lot in that transactional space that Crystal talked about earlier. So much of service learning, so much of community engagement is transactional. It's part of, 10 points on your grade, as opposed to a true meaningful engagement and relationship building with the communities in which we're located.
You, at some point, one of our panelists mentioned change at the ballot box. What can we do to make sure when votes simply don't exist, either because of suppression, indifference, or some other weapon? And then I'm going to close up the conversation, invite you guys, if you have any remaining last words you'd like to leave us with. And thank you for your time and for being here.
I think Dre alluded to some of that with the work he did in Rochester and mobilizing people to sleep in at the steps of the Capitol and all of these things. So in Indian River County, we have that group of moms that started up, and it started at one mom's kitchen table, but now all over the place, we have this group that's there, but they've garnered so much attention, so much support, so much funding from different organizations. But one of the beautiful things that demonstrates and will continue to demonstrate is if there is a cohesive voice that is persevering and unrelenting, people will listen. They listened with Drain Rochester, they listened here in Indian River County. It's not feeling hopeless. It is continuing to find a source to remain hopeful, and then using your voice, but not just singularly, but having this shared agenda and this purpose and passion and advocating as a whole, and doing it as innovative and radical as you need to, but letting people know that you won't go silently into the night, right? It's staying there and by any means necessary.
Thank you. I'd like to, before I close out and thank you, any last words? This has been an amazing conversation there are so many directions in which we could have gone in this because there's so much substance here. What do you want to leave us with? For everybody who is on this call, if you could summarize for them or give them an essence you would like to leave them with, what would that be?
Okay, so I'll have to go back to how I like to keep my foot on the gas. All gas, no brakes is kind of the type of person I am. I speak with intentionality. So there's intentionality in the words that I choose, and I try to choose them very wisely and carefully. And so when I say radical revolutionary change, that is actually really what I mean of radical and revolutionary change. Innovative just doesn't do it the same justice, because I think if your son or daughter was walking home with an Arizona iced tea and a bag of Skittles, and she's hunted down and killed, and the person who kills him or her is not put in jail immediately, and then they get off in the court case. If my son or daughter was walking home and with an Arizona iced tea and some Skittles, and they were killed, I would absolutely burn down the Target. So I want to step back on that. I want to go back to that I said earlier. Like, I'm not just telling people to go burn Targets down. I'm saying that the injustice that Black bodies have faced for centuries in this country, in order for it to change, will need radical and revolutionary change. You really would have to subscribe to that notion. I don't know other folks' journey or where they've been, but when your back is against the wall and you have nothing else, you will do anything and everything to survive, to get a sense of justice for yourself. So I just wanted to kind of put a exclamation point on that. I thought about the quote by James Baldwin, who was one of my favorite writers. And he said, to be Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time. And some of my white friends will be like, Dre, you're always talking about race. You're always talking about race. And I'm like, geez, I really wish I didn't have to. If I didn't have to, I wouldn't. But every day I walk out of the house, I experience microaggressions and slights and these implicit biases where I'm reminded about race. When I go to work and they say, oh, look at your hair, can I touch it? It's like, wait a minute, what? What are you talking about? No, you're not. What are you talking about? So for me, I do want to see radical and revolutionary change. Innovative just wouldn't quite cut it for me if a loved one was killed and no type of justice was served at all. So I just wanted to kind of put an exclamation point on that intentionality behind those words and just seeing that process come through in a revolutionary and radical way.
Thank you. Janet, final words?
I think about Diane Nash talking about her practice and her civil rights action as the radical practice of love. And I think if we get to justice, perhaps through the radical practice of love, and if we can embrace that radical practice of love and think of that as the goal, and justice is the in the meantime step to try to get us to a radical practice of love, that's where I'd like to see us go.
Thank you. Crystal, last words.
So I think me and Dre were on the same wavelength. The only thing I could come up with was a James Baldwin quote where he says, "I love this country so much, I reserve the right to constantly or perpetually criticize it," right? So when you hear people with pushbacks, it's not pushbacks because, oh, they're always complaining about something. Accountability is never an attack. Accountability is a person communicating just how much they buy into an ideal, how much they want to see it done to fidelity because they believe in the work and the impact of it. And because they see that it's not being done, they want to see it done, so they will continue to check in and to say, hey, get back on task. This is what we need to do. Let's do it. That is the greatest expression of love, is accountability. So when you see these talks, this is what has to be normalized. This is how the discomfort and the disease goes away. It's because we're making it the comfortable conversation to have because we're buying into the outcome, not just the check boxes. So I reserve the right to constantly and perpetually criticize this country because I love it so much.
Thank you. David, last word.
Our identities, our very understanding of ourselves has been formed in relationship to a network of unjust systems and marginalizing narratives, which means that none of us in our current state are actually prepared to live in a just and equitable society as we are. We have to begin with deep personal, interpersonal investigation of who we would be if society was just, and then live as though it is being just, which means we're going to bump up against a lot of systems. We're going to get bruised because the systems aren't organized for people who are committed to justice. Got that? That's just how you're living. If you're living comfortably and going with the flow, then you are perpetuating, you are affirming, you are validating injustice. In fact, I love the constant reference, Dre's constant reference to Malcolm, even to Martin, because what we know is the pursuit of justice is in fact a death cult. You got to be willing to have your identity completely die in order to find our way into a society where justice is the norm. But I'm looking forward to it, and I'm willing to die with all of you.
I think I speak on behalf of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, the Sandler School of Social Work, the College for Social Work and Criminal Justice, when I offer my deep and profound thanks to all of you for being here and engaging in this conversation. I offer that thanks to our participants, without whom this conversation wouldn't happen and would not be nearly as rich. So thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here, for your presence, for your words, for whatever it was that you gave up in order to spend this time here with us today. On behalf of our entire team, I thank you with all my heart. I love that we ended on the notion of love. I want a woman, Valerie Carr, has written a book, Revolutionary Love. And Lama Rod Owens has written a book, Love and Rage. And I think as we look towards these concepts of justice and injustice, and we talk how that fits with concepts of love, we leave in a good place here. It is not easy work. It's certainly not simple work. It is work that most of us here have committed to do ongoingly. in our life, in our work, in our practice, in our being. So thank you for being the living examples of that with whom we could have this conversation tonight. Thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Thanks.